Tony, people might have been aware of the nurses being on strike, but they might not be aware of the industrial action that you are taking, the paramedics here. So can you tell me about the background to this industrial action?
The background is simple. We organised in 2010 a branch of the P&A called NASRA, and it represents paramedics of the National Ambulance Service. We had 350 people being deducted their union fees by payroll, and when we had a further almost 170 or 80 forms to process, they decided that we were getting too big for them to handle. And so what they did was they pulled the plug, wouldn't process any more forms and wouldn't deduct any more union fees for our existing members. Essentially what they tried to do was deploy a union busting tactic to wipe us out. And so on the back of that, the dispute is with regard to our fundamental right to be represented by a trade union of our choice. What we're saying is that it's clearly a democratic right for us to make that decision ourselves, and it's specific to ourselves. It's not the business of the employer, it's not the business of any employer who represents a worker. And if a worker is to have confidence in due process and natural justice, the fundamental ingredient in relation to having confidence in that process is that they have a choice to join their own trade union and to have their own representative represent them.
And can you tell me, what has the response from the public been? I mean, we know that there was huge support for the nurses when they were out on strike. So what response have you got here?
Well, when you say the public, what you mean is the real employer. The employer actually agrees with our claim. The employer is the public. The employer pay our wages, and the employer agree with the fundamental ingredient and subject matter of the dispute. There's no reasonable individual would ever agree that an employer should, such as the HSE, should actually determine and choose which union a worker should join. Most reasonable people on the street understand the process of natural justice, and you don't have to explain to too many people which side of the line they should be on with regard to that issue. So the support from the public is that they do agree. But also we'd like to remind the public that they are the employer, and they also employ the minister. So come the next election, they can actually sack him if they wish.
Richard, why do you think that this particular industrial dispute is so important?
Because I think it's just unbelievable that any employer, but even more so a public employer, the HSE in this case, should think they have the right to decide which union should represent their employees. I mean, it's a basic democratic right to have freedom of association and to be able to join the trade union of your choice and not be told by your employer which union you should be a part of. I mean, that sort of thing is something you expect in a dictatorship, not in a democracy. So it's a very fundamental principle that's at stake here. And I think anybody who was even, briefly familiar with the reasons why these fellas are on strike would say they would support that basic principle.
And has there been any comments by the Minister for Health, Simon Harris, regarding this?
Yeah, we've questioned him, myself, Breed Smith and others have questioned him, and we get this sort of ridiculous response, which is that it would become difficult to manage for the HSE if they had to deal with more unions. Now, that is totally preposterous. I mean, there are multiple industries where you had several unions operating. Construction, for example, you'd have electricians' unions, you'd have several general workers' unions, you'd have carpenters' unions, painters' unions, and the employer has to deal with all of them. So this is standard practice. But of course, really what I'm sure is at the back of this is substantial issues that these workers and their union, NASRA and the P&A, are not willing to accept erosion of their conditions, and the employer, the HSE, don't want to deal with a union that's willing to stand up for its members.